Okay, so I'm actually quite good position because after the two presentation, I don't have to explain what job polarization is and what's routinization and so on, which makes things easier. The paper that I'm presenting here is a joint work of myself and 3 colleagues of mine who are out there in the last row, and we actually want to look at the similar processes of polarization and routinization of labor market in Central and Eastern European countries. Why we found it is important or interesting? Because over the last 25 years, the labor market in this part of the world has changed dramatically. On the one hand, there has been structural change in the form of reducing unemployment in agriculture, in declining employment in manufacturing, not so much, but definitely in a shifting structure of branches within manufacturing. There has been a services growth, but also an evolving structure of services. So that the distinction between simple services and high-skilled services that Christian made is very relevant also for analyzing the labor market in this part of the world. So, because some of you know this building, some of you don't know it because many people are in Warsaw for the first time, as far as I know. This thing here is the former building of Polish National Television. It was dismantled in February, if I remember correctly. This beauty here is a new building. So as you can see, it changed a lot, at least on the outside, and we want to check how much the things inside have changed, in the sense what is the nature of jobs now in comparison to what was the nature of jobs back in the 90s and in the early 2000s. Our empirical strategy is to use the EU LFS data from 1998-2013. That's basically because they are available since 1998. We cannot really go further back. And we also use the two ONET data sets, 2003 and 2014. ONET is an American data set which measures task contents of jobs, so what particular occupations are comprised of. We merge them together, and then we use the Otor-Acemoglu methodology of ascribing task contents for occupations. And we work at the ISCO-free level, so we have about approximately 130 occupations. And then we calculate for every worker in between 1998 and 2013 5 task contents, which are standards for the literature. These are non-routine cognitive analytical, non-routine cognitive interpersonal, and routine cognitive, and 2 types of manual tasks that I will show in a minute. And then we'll try to understand what's going on and what are the factors that can explain this development. So the main development here is that if you look at the evolution of task content of jobs in Central Eastern European countries, we analyzed 9 of them. And this is the average for the region. You find 2 very familiar findings, which are also found for the US, Germany, and UK, and so on. And these are the growth in non-routine cognitive analytical and non-routine cognitive personal tasks. They actually started rising as soon as the data was available, and they keep growing. The other quite common finding is the decline in manual tasks on the labor market. And we actually observe that both the non-routine manual physical and the routine manual tasks are declining in the region here. So there is a slight difference in comparison to the US, where the non-routine manual jobs and tasks are increasing. It's not the case in the region here. But the most interesting difference is that actually the routine cognitive tasks and the routine cognitive jobs are increasing in Central and Eastern Europe. So the starting point of the entire polarization narrative is simply not there, because you just require the routine cognitive jobs to decline. However, if we look country by country, there are some differences when it comes to what happens to the routine cognitive tasks in the region. We can identify 3 groups of countries. I mean, obviously those where the routine cognitive tasks have been increasing, and these are basically 3 Baltic states plus Romania. And we see 4 countries were more or less stable, grew a little bit, but definitely less than in the first set. The Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, Croatia. And we have only 2 countries, Hungary, Slovenia, when the routine cognitive tasks have been declining over the period studied. So as this is basically the main source of heterogeneity between these countries, on the next slide I will focus on one example from each set: Estonia, Poland, and Slovenia. Let me move on. So the first exercise we do is a shift-share look at how the evolution of task content developed. So we actually calculate what was the contribution of changes in the task content of jobs driven by between occupation, so effects, so reallocations from one occupations to the other. What was the contribution what was the contribution of task content changes within occupation, so like increasing the routine or non-routine content of a particular occupation, and we also analyze what is the importance of interaction between the two. When we look at the non-routine cognitive tasks, both analytical and personal, I'm just showing analytical, personal are very similar, we find that they have been driven by the between effect. So it's basically reallocation of workers from one type of jobs into other types of jobs, or in other words, the emergence of new types of jobs which were not there at the late 90s. And it's basically driven by the between effect. The within effect is relatively small and somehow visible in Poland, Estonia. That means that in some occupations that were critical for the non-routine cognitive analytical task contents in the early 90s, that component of the job has actually increased over the years. But on the other hand, the interaction term in all three countries is negative. That actually means that shift in the employment structure, which was recorded in the countries of the region, actually went into occupations which back in the 90s have lower non-routine analytical content than those occupations that constituted the stock. So they grew, but at the same time, those that grew were relatively less intensive in the non-routine cognitive task than the average stock in the late 90s. When it comes to routine cognitive, just to remind you, this is the biggest difference between the three countries. When it comes to routine cognitive, we can see that decline in Slovenia would be the same in Hungary, was driven by the between effect. So there is a shift of employment out of routine cognitive jobs into other types of them. In Poland, that shift was very low, basically non-existent. There was an important interaction effect, the same in Estonia. That actually means that there has been increasing employment in occupations that were highly intensive in routine cognitive tasks, early 90s. At the same time, the within effect is negative. That means that the routine cognitive content of these occupations declined a bit, but nevertheless, they increased in total. And when it comes to decline in manual tasks, that was mainly due to between effects, and the shift of the employment out of agriculture plays an important role here. The next exercise we do is to try to understand if it was really like reallocating of workers, or if it was rather creating new jobs for new types of workers, younger probably, and some other developments affecting older workers. When we say reallocate, we think that, okay, people are moving from routine cognitive to non-routine cognitive. But is it really the case? So what was the intergenerational aspect of these developments? On the next three slides, I'm going to show you the contribution of various cohorts born between 1949, and actually should be before 1949 here as well. I think just the screen gets a little bit crazy here. So on this slide, we show the contribution of various cohorts born from the 1949 up to 1998. So this is 50 years of birth into the growth of task contents, again, analytical, routine cognitive, routine manual. So what is basically the most striking thing here is that the most of the growth in non-routine cognitive analytical tasks can be assigned to what happened to people born between 1969 and 1984. So the entire development in the increasing non-routine cognitive task is basically the kind of jobs that people who were born after the 1917 and actually entered the labor market after the economic transitions from the early 90s what happened to them. When it comes to older workers, we see a slight growth in countries like Slovenia, which were successful in terms of non-routine cognitive analytical. Very tiny effects for Estonia. Poland fell somewhere in between. When it comes to routine cognitive task, it's a sort of reflection. It's a sort of a reflection to what happened to non-routine cognitive analytical. We see that the decline was mainly because of young people, those who were, I mean, young, yeah, we're still all young here in this room. So young people born in the 70s and 80s who recorded a decline in the routine cognitive content and at the same time recorded an increase in non-routine cognitive content. If there were any contributions to the growth in the routine cognitive task, they were rather by older workers. At the same time, you can see that when it comes to younger groups, that's 84, 88, you can see that they still contribute positively, like in Estonia and Poland, to routine cognitive, whereas those born few years earlier, they basically shifted out of the routine cognitive tasks jobs into the non-routine cognitive tasks. The decline in routine manual tasks is widespread across the generations, with exception for entrants who tend to enter the labor market in the routine manual jobs very often. So people born after 89 are actually the only cohort which contributes to the growth in these tasks. The next question we want to ask is to try to understand what were the relations between this process of, let's say, de-routinization, so the growth of non-routine cognitive tasks on the labor market, decline in routine cognitive tasks on the labor market, and the workforce upgrading. Those of you who know the region know that there has been increasing educational attainment, especially in a country like Poland. There has been a shift out of the vocational education into secondary education, and then from secondary education into tertiary education. So the educational structure of the workforce changed dramatically. So to analyze if we can correlate the developments in task content of jobs with what happened to the workforce structure in terms of education, so actually to the workforce upgrading, using the term introduced by John in the morning, we run a fixed effects estimation when we estimate the every task on just the share of workers with tertiary educated workers, primary educated, plus a share of R&D in GDP as a control for technology adoption. So we don't really aspire to any causality here to prevent any question. We just try to see how much the developments can be merged together. And it finds out that actually both non-routine cognitive personal, the developments in both non-routine analytical and personal tasks are significantly related to how the structure of the workforce evolves in terms of the share of tertiary educated people. What happened below tertiary education, be it if there were people with secondary education or just primary education, doesn't really matter. It was all about the increase of tertiary educated people. The R&D in GDP as a control for some kind of technology adoption turns out significant. On the other hand, we see that with routine cognitive, we find that the correlation with both the share of tertiary educated people and the share of primary educated people is negative. So that shows that the routine cognitive jobs are disrelated with the middle level of skills, and these are middling occupations. When it comes to manual, with the routine manual, we find the negative correlation with tertiary educated, strong positive correlation with primary educated people. With non-routine manual physical, we find it's all about the share of primary educated. So we think that that kind of look on how the task content in the Central Eastern Europe evolved, that sort of is to me sort of reminiscent of how Andrea looks at the developments and the polarization in the UK. So let's have another look on this fixed effects estimation. On this slide we calculate how much of the actual change can be explained by these parameters and the developments in the variables that I have shown on the previous slide. And you can see that it fares pretty well, with exception of Lithuania, Slovakia, Romania. The estimation basically replicates the actual growth in non-routine cognitive analytical tasks. You can also see that the contribution of workforce upgrading, tertiary and general, basically tertiary, was highest in Poland and Slovenia, with two countries which recorded a substantial growth in non-routine cognitive analytical tasks. In the other countries, that was a little bit smaller. Estonia stands out as a country where the part assigned to R&D is relatively high. When it comes to decline in routine manual tasks, that's basically about, according to our estimation, about the shift out of the primary education. So the increase of people who are getting at least secondary education. So the decline of very low-skilled workers correlates with the decline in routine manual tasks. And just to conclude, what we find is that the general picture of how the tasks evolve in Europe, in this part of Europe, is similar to what was recorded in the other parts of the world, highly developed parts of the world, with exception for the routine cognitive tasks. However, the question is how long will the routine cognitive task hold firm on the labor market? One can argue that in the recent few years, as the wages in the region are relatively low, you can see that the investment in routine cognitive jobs is probably a good idea here. Just to use the anecdotal evidence, there are a lot of these shared services, accounting, centers being built to deliver services internationally. However, we can wonder if wages go up, how long that routine cognitive task will actually stay important, and when is this moment when the companies decide maybe to switch into more non-routine and ICT-intensive way of doing things, or shift the jobs further east. Another finding is the huge intergenerational divide. We have a separate paper on Poland where we are able to go a little more detailed on this intergenerational thing, and you can see that the evolution of task content within cohorts was very, very different between those born after 70s and before. So it could be the case that the intergenerational divide in that regard is a one-off phenomenon, because all the ICT requiring jobs and basically the jobs that require a use of computer, they emerged in the late 90s and early 2000s, so they just left one generation behind who was not really keen into learning all this stuff. And the next, let's say, upgrading in the ICT will not have this generationally polarizing effect, because now everyone will be more or less familiar with ICT, but it could be a question for, let's say, emerging economies, which are probably to experience a similar, let's say, adoption these days or anytime soon. And we also can wonder whether the workforce upgrading, which so far has translated into rising non-cognitive contents of jobs, can it really continue to improve the task content structure? Because when as the share of tertiary graduates in the workforce has actually increased, that currently about 50% of people aged, let's say, 1924 in Poland are involved in tertiary education. So probably there is some decreasing marginal return in terms of non-routine content of jobs that they can get. And that's it. And now I'm going to thank you for your attention, and we move to the discussion part.